this year, as my mother was going through some of her parents' papers, I know none of you have boxes of things from your parents who have passed away more than a decade ago in your house. But she found a binder with a sermon in it, though, to be clear, my grandfather would have called it a talk, like many of you do, right? That my grandfather, Randy Bramwell, gave at the Unitarian Society of New Brunswick, New Jersey, in around the year 2000. And he, was very clear that it was a society, not a church, in the way that many of you are clear that this is a fellowship. And it was a talk, not a sermon. And my grandparents had been members of that congregation since the early 1960s, and my grandfather had done many things for the congregation in New Brunswick over the years, including designing their logo, serving as board chairman, and also doing skits at their annual cabaret as the Karnak character from the old Johnny Carson show. A real Renaissance man. And he was giving this talk in the time leading up to my grandparents moving from New Jersey out here to Wisconsin to be close to my own mother, as my grandfather's health was failing. And in this talk, in this sermon, he covers a lot of ground, including spilling lots of very hot gossip about the congregational drama from the 1970s. It was really good. But I will not digress to that here, because I could just spend the whole time talking about old congregational drama. Instead, the part that has remained on my mind is something he talked about in the introduction, sort of. It's almost like an aside from his perspective. He was talking about how some of the old habits of longer-term members were hard to break. And he talked about how weird it was to have a minister who was younger than he was, who used email. And to be clear, this minister who was younger than he was, I think was in his 50s. And in this conversation about how there were some habits of longer-term members that were hard to break, he admitted how astonished he was that there were younger members, newer members of the congregation who didn't necessarily know him, but who had still reached out to offer care as his health concerns deepened. He said, "I've come across people I don't even know who care about my health." And then this was written on a typewriter, and so then in his ink script to add, he wrote, "genuinely care," as if it was astonishing that people should care about him. And it was this little aside, but for me, this idea that there are people who don't really know you that well, who genuinely care about you and about your life and about your well-being, that is the context in which everything else about our life as a religious community takes place. Right? This all happens in the context of a profound concern about one another, about our well-being, and about how we might meet one another in our moments of most profound need. It's about the reality that when life is at its most tenuous, as we wait for diagnoses and scan results, as we navigate divorce and death and loss, as we struggle with addiction, as we make and remake our identities and values, as we face oppression, we need to be held in community. We deserve to be held in community. Right? And so when things are at their most difficult, it is the promise of religious community rather than the promise of any religious ideology that will carry us through life's ups and downs. But did you know we almost didn't become a community? We almost didn't become a denomination. In 1819, the Reverend William Ellery Channing gave a sermon at what was then the First Independent Church of Baltimore, called On Unitarian Christianity. And until that point in history, the term Unitarian had mostly been an insult that more traditional Christian Congregationalists used to make fun of people who read the scriptures and decided that there was no evidence for the Trinity held within them. And they called themselves liberal Christians. That was their term for themselves, but everyone wanted to insult them by calling them Unitarians. But on that day, William Ellery Channing laid out his arguments at great length. Anyone who has been to seminary can tell you. And the sermon quickly became an enormously popular pamphlet. It was like the second most popular pamphlet in the entire United States at the time. And many of the people who kind of agreed with Channing over time, slowly, grudgingly, began to sort of reclaim the term Unitarian, and since he had popularized it, they used it to describe themselves. And the church, this sermon that Channing gave was so important that they literally named the physical pulpit he gave it in after him. It's there. And I can say from experience that it is very bizarre to preach in a pulpit that you could literally hold a children's tea party inside of. Like, there's enough space for, like, genuinely a children's tea party inside of that pulpit. It's very big. You're like, I don't know, am I supposed to use all of the space or not? And in the United States, the creation of the American Unitarian Association, which happened in 1825, was the first time that all of these people who were rejecting the doctrine of the Trinity all over the eastern part of our country, that for the first time, they decided they were not just going to be a bunch of free thinkers kind of set loose in the wild. They would instead consolidate institutional power into the American Unitarian Association. But that was not without controversy. Right? In fact, William Ellery Channing, Mr. Unitarian himself, was invited to serve as the American Unitarian Association's first president, and he declined because he was concerned that creating an institution would take power away from individuals. And he wasn't really fully bought in. And this congregation where we gather today, though obviously it was not founded in this room, was first conceived in 1955 by a dozen founders from Unitarian, Quaker, Universalist, and ethical culture, which is a flavor of religious humanism, right? So from all of those backgrounds, about a dozen founders in 1955 began the Fox Valley Liberal Religious Fellowship. And eventually, they chose to affiliate with what was still called the American Unitarian Association in 1957, when they officially incorporated. By then, they had grown to 19 members. And they were all willing to join together and assert their values and convictions in a world that often felt hostile to those values and convictions. And in this moment we all occupy in 2025, when so much of the world once again feels hostile to our values, it is so easy to feel powerless and to turn inward and to disconnect as a result of that overwhelming hostility, to throw up our hands at the enormity of the evil, to go numb. I don't know about you all, but I certainly feel that temptation all the time these days, to go numb as we watch yet another video of someone being abducted by ICE agents, right, to dissociate from the panic, as yet more healthcare for trans and non-binary people is profoundly threatened, right? And sometimes to try in vain to exert control wherever I can, because everything else feels so out of control. And given all of that reality, when we gather as a congregation, a sort of tension emerges. I don't know if you all feel it, but I think I certainly do. Those of us in leadership certainly do. A tension about whether this should be a place where you can come to escape that world. Should this be where you come to contemplate, to rest, to recover away from all of that? Or should this be the place you come to get fired up? To have your conscience pricked into action, to be convicted that you must act boldly now? Should this be a place that centers you and your individual needs? Should this be a place of profound collective action? And when we talk about that tension, when I think about that tension, and it is that, it's tension rather than opposition, I will confess that I see yet another binary that I cannot wait to smash. Because it is this very tension and our willingness to engage it that makes this congregation, this type of religious community, so essential right now. Because there are lots of places where you can go for escape or even individual spiritual nourishment right now. From bars to coffee shops to yoga studios to book clubs to hiking trails, there are tons of places you can go to connect with your own spiritual path and escape the world. And there's also plenty of places you can go to work collectively against oppression. There are political parties, community organizing groups, nonprofits on every corner. But the reason I continue to believe in the necessity of this place is that we have declared that we need both. We need both a rigorous respect for the individual and an investment in the infrastructure of an institution, a community that will outlive us. And I would also add that for those of us who have an identity that is at risk in our world right now, the idea that my individual spiritual reflection and action against systems of oppression in the world can be discreetly, and neatly separated is out of touch with my lived reality. There's a popular reading that if you've hung around for a few years, you've probably heard either Christina or I quote at some point by the Reverend Wayne Arneson. It's in the back of our gray hymnal. And it speaks to how confusing and difficult life is, and then it ends, "For deep down there is another truth. You are not alone." Right, and that is a popular reading for a reason. How many of us have not needed the message, "You are not alone," at some point in our lives? However dark the path feels, you have companions on it. It's powerful. But right now, I'm not sure that just not being alone is really enough. Right now, as the people we love in this congregation, in our families, in our communities, in our city, as those people are at risk, I would say that it's not enough to just congregate. It isn't enough to just all happen to show up at the same time on Sunday mornings and contemplate our spiritual journeys next to each other. Because at some point, we have to invest, not only in a place that makes each of us as an individual feel good or loved, but that carries our values forward and outward in ways that are larger and longer lasting than any of us can conceive of right now. When I think about the founders, the dozen founders of this congregation, I would bet money that this is not the thing specifically that they pictured when they gathered in November 1955. But it is what they created. And I imagine that 70 years from now, there will be something, whether it's here in this room or in a different space, there will be something here that is entirely different than what any of us could imagine right now. I sometimes also think about, could William Ellery Channing have imagined this? I don't think so. Sometimes I wonder, I don't even think my own grandfather could have imagined this. He died when I was in high school, so he never got to see this evolution of me in congregational life. And yet, we are here because all of those people invested in this place, in this community, in this tradition. They determined that doing it alone was not gonna cut it for them. Right? And like I said during the Wonder Box, that idea of investing and being vested in a community and these vestments, these symbols of power and authority that we all share, that investment in this place means that this is where we bring our power together to grow it, not to serve ourselves, but to lift all of us, and to lift a future that we will never see. And sometimes when we talk about this investment in who we are as a community, to avoid discomfort, we sort of soft pedal the part of the conversation that's about money, about financial investment in our life together. But those of you who are members of the congregation and check your email already know, which is fewer of you than you might think. We've been using email in congregational life for multiple decades now, but we still haven't quite got the hang of it. Right, you know that the fellowship cannot actually afford to soft pedal the money conversation right now. Right, for the fiscal year that's going to start in July, we're facing a $106,000 budget deficit and subsequent budget cuts, sparked by a combination of deeply pervasive economic anxiety that's making it harder for people to commit their dollars generously, a reserve cushion of leftover paycheck protection funds from 2020 that is running out, and joy of joys, an upcoming required mortgage refinance that will substantially increase our interest rate. Commercial mortgages are a trip, you guys. Right? And you may be thinking, this does not feel like escaping the world, Reverend Hannah. But this is our community. This is the place that we have created together. And a congregation's budget is a reflection of its mission and its vision and of the investments that its members are willing and able to make in the service of that mission. Right? It's not a reflection of how much service we can provide you based on some subscription fee that you pay. There is no fellowship premium where you get to skip the announcements at the end, or the pieces of the service you don't like. There's no. The truth is that when you bring your resources here, your spirit and your money and your time and your one wild and precious life, my goodness, when you choose to spend it here with us in committee meetings, in RE classrooms, in this space, in the choir, you are saying that you believe power is best shared, that power is most useful in advancing our values when we direct it collectively. And right now in our world, many of the places where in the past we invested, where we shared our collective power for the common good, public schools, universities, nonprofits largely funded by government grants and other civic spaces, many, if not most of those places right now are ceding their commitments to inclusion and diversity out of fear of losing their funding. And I understand that it is a complicated decision that they are facing. But I would say that given that reality, there has never been a better time to become vested in this place, in these people, and in this community that will not downplay the belovedness of our trans and queer kin, that will not soft pitch our commitment to reproductive freedom and the necessity of abortion as health care, that will not mumble when we say Black Lives Matter, that will not equivocate when we proclaim that migration is beautiful and no human being is illegal, and that will not falter when asked to meet you in your moments of most profound need, regardless of how you got there. There's never been a more important time, too, I would say, to become vested in a community that at its core asserts the necessity of thinking for yourself. and not capitulating to the status quo when you know it to be untrue. And 200 years ago, the founders of the American Unitarian Association made an imperfect but deeply faithful choice to take a group of individual free thinkers and create an institution that they would vest with the authority to carry out their vision not just in their lifetimes, but long into the future. That's what the future sounds like. As my grandfather went on in the last talk he gave at the Unitarian Society of New Brunswick, he talked about what it was like to talk about his death and his legacy with his family. And he shared a piece of wisdom with the gathered congregation. He said, "When I pass on, you'll go on until you are the old-time members of this society and of our society with a small s." Essentially, he was saying, I was charged with the care of this institution for many years, sharing it and growing it, even when it was painful. And someday, soon, you will be charged with caring for this institution until you, too, are old and tired and wish that the minister did not use this newfangled electronic communication platform. I cannot wait until I can be grouchy about whatever way people are talking to each other in the future. Right? Generation after generation, we will always be carrying each other through this life. We are the inheritors and the shapers of a long legacy of struggling to build a collective of free thinkers. We are the inheritors and shapers of a long legacy of what it means to face injustice fiercely while caring for one another tenderly. We will face this moment together because that is what is required and nothing less will do. Every day, in a million different ways, both minuscule and enormous, when our hearts are breaking, when the path is uncertain, when we're dancing with joy, when we're singing our hope with our whole chests, when we are resting, and goodness knows when we are worn out, we will carry each other. Nothing less will do. May it be so.